April 22, 1915. Ypres, Belgium. German forces release chlorine gas across a World War I battlefield. 5,000 Allied soldiers die choking in the trenches. It's the first large-scale chemical attack in modern warfare, and it's so horrific that the world agrees never to use chemical weapons again. Fast forward 92 years. February 2007. Ramadi, Iraq. A truck bomb detonates, releasing a yellow-green cloud into the streets. It's chlorine again, the same chemical weapon from World War I, but now in the hands of insurgents using industrial materials instead of military weapons. History was repeating itself, but nobody was ready for it. This is how Iraq became the site of the first sustained improvised chemical warfare campaign since the trenches of World War I. Let's talk about what chlorine actually is, because most people think they know, but they're only half right. You've encountered chlorine dozens of times. It's in your tap water, keeping bacteria from making you sick. It's what makes swimming pools smell the way they do, though that's actually not pure chlorine you're smelling. It's the compound chlorine creates when it reacts with organic material. It's in bleach, in PVC pipes, in thousands of industrial processes. Chlorine is one of the most common chemicals in modern civilization. But chlorine in its pure form, molecular chlorine Cl, is not the friendly chemical you encounter daily. It's a yellow-green gas that's 2.5 times heavier than air, which means it sinks and accumulates in low places. It's toxic, and when it comes into contact with the moisture in your eyes, throat, and lungs, something terrifying happens. It forms hydrochloric acid. Your own body moisture becomes the delivery mechanism for acid that burns tissue from the inside. This is why chlorine gas was the first chemical weapon ever used in modern warfare. On April 22, 1915, at Ypres, Belgium, German forces released 168 tons of chlorine gas from cylinders along the Western Front. Allied soldiers watched a greenish-yellow cloud rolling toward them across no man's land and had no idea what they were seeing. Within minutes, thousands were choking, drowning in fluid their own damaged lungs were producing, dying in ways that bullets and shells couldn't replicate. It was terrifying, it was effective, and it changed warfare forever. But here's the thing about chlorine as a weapon. It's actually not very good at what it's supposed to do. Compared to nerve agents like sarin or VX, compared to mustard gas, compared to modern military chemical weapons, chlorine is crude and inefficient. It requires huge amounts to be lethal. It dissipates quickly in open air. Wind can blow it back at the people who released it. And because it's visible and has a distinctive smell, that bleach smell is detectable at concentrations of just 0.2 to 0.4 parts per million, well before dangerous levels. People can often see or smell it coming and take protective action. The numbers tell the story. OSHA says the safe exposure limit for an 8-hour workday is 1 part per million. At 10 ppm, you're at the immediately dangerous to life or health level. At 40 to 60 ppm for 30 minutes, you're risking permanent lung damage. And to kill 50% of exposed subjects, the LC50 that toxicologists use to measure lethality, you need 293 ppm for a full hour. That's a lot of chlorine gas, sustained for a long time. This is why actual military chemical weapons programs abandoned chlorine within a few years of World War I. They developed phosgene, which is deadlier and less detectable, then mustard gas, which causes horrific injuries, then nerve agents that can kill in seconds at tiny concentrations. By World War II, chlorine was obsolete as a military weapon, but in 2007, insurgents in Iraq didn't need a military-grade chemical weapon. They needed something that would terrify people, that would generate headlines, that would make occupation forces and Iraqi civilians feel like nowhere was safe. And chlorine was perfect for that. Not because it was deadly, but because it was available. It was scary, and it was something that civilized nations had agreed never to use in warfare again. That's the paradox of chlorine bombs in Iraq. They were terrifying precisely because they weren't very effective. And to understand why insurgents used them anyway, we need to understand what was happening in Iraq in late 2006 and early 2007. By the fall of 2006, the Iraq War was a disaster by almost any measure. The initial invasion in 2003 had gone fine. Saddam's military collapsed in weeks, but the occupation turned into a nightmare. Sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia had exploded into something approaching civil war. Baghdad was averaging over 100 bodies per day dumped in the streets, victims of death squads from both sides. The insurgency had evolved into a sophisticated, multi-layered threat that was killing Iraqi civilians and American soldiers with increasing effectiveness. IEDs, improvised explosive devices, were the signature weapon of the insurgency. By late 2006, insurgents were detonating over 2,500 IEDs per month across Iraq. They'd evolved from crude artillery shells wired to cell phones into sophisticated weapons with infrared triggers, pressure plates, and EFPs, explosively formed penetrators, that could punch through armored vehicles. American forces were adapting. Jammers to block radio signals, better armor, route clearance teams, intelligence networks to track bomb makers. But the insurgents kept adapting too. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, the organization led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, until his death in June 2006, controlled significant territory in Anbar Province and operated freely in parts of Baghdad. They'd pioneered suicide bombing as a primary tactic, conducting multiple attacks per day. They'd bombed the Golden Mosque in Samarra in February 2006, igniting the sectarian civil war. They'd turned Iraq into the most dangerous place on earth for journalists, aid workers, and anyone associated with the occupation. But by late 2006, AQI and other Sunni insurgent groups faced a problem. Their tactics were becoming less effective. American forces had adapted to suicide bombings and IEDs. Iraqi security forces were improving. The Shia militias that AQI wanted to provoke into overreacting were doing exactly that, but it wasn't leading to the sectarian apocalypse Zarqawi had envisioned. It was just creating chaos that hurt Sunni civilians as much as anyone. AQI needed something new, something that would generate terror beyond what conventional explosives could achieve, something that would get international attention and undermine confidence in the occupation's ability to protect people, something that would make the Iraq War even more unpalatable to the American public than it already was. They found it in Chlorine. The first hints came in late 2006, reports of attacks that included some kind of chemical component, though details were vague. But January 2007 marked the beginning of a sustained campaign. Between January and June 2007, insurgents would conduct somewhere between 60 and 100 chlorine attacks across Anbar Province and Baghdad. The exact number is hard to pin down because not every attack was fully documented, and some incidents that people thought were chlorine attacks turned out to be conventional bombs, while the panic made people report chlorine even when there wasn't any. The attacks followed a pattern. A truck loaded with conventional explosives, ammonium nitrate, artillery shells, whatever was available, and industrial chlorine containers. Gas cylinders, liquid chlorine tanks from water treatment plants, industrial-sized containers from factories. The truck would be driven to a target, a police station, a marketplace, a checkpoint, a residential neighborhood, and detonated. The explosion itself would kill or injure people through blast and fragmentation, just like any car bomb. But then the chlorine containers would rupture, and the compressed gas or rapidly vaporizing liquid chlorine would mix with the explosion's heat and pressure, creating a toxic cloud that spread from the blast site. Because chlorine is heavier than air, it would flow like a liquid into buildings through broken windows, into basements and low-lying areas, through streets and alleyways, sometimes spreading for blocks depending on the wind. February 21, 2007, Ramadi. This was the attack that really got attention, that made it clear chlorine bombs were now a sustained tactic rather than an experiment. It happened in mid-afternoon in the Malab district. A truck approached a checkpoint, accelerated past barriers, and detonated in a crowded area. The explosion itself was significant. Eyewitnesses reported feeling the blast wave from blocks away. But what came next was what made this attack different. Soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment, who were conducting a patrol nearby, saw the yellow-green clouds spreading from the blast site. Some of them had seen industrial chemical accidents before. Some had trained for CBRN scenarios. They knew immediately what they were looking at. Chlorine gas. The symptoms appeared quickly. Civilians in the immediate area collapsed, coughing violently, clutching their throats. The distinctive smell, like bleach mixed with something acrid and chemical, spread rapidly. Soldiers trying to help victims found themselves coughing, eyes burning, struggling to breathe. The gas flowed into buildings through windows shattered by the blast, into shops and homes where people thought they were safe. The immediate casualty count was relatively low, somewhere between 5 and 10 deaths directly from the attack, with most fatalities from the explosion itself rather than chlorine exposure. But over 100 people sought medical treatment for respiratory symptoms, eye irritation, and burns, and the psychological impact was far greater than the physical casualties would suggest. This wasn't an isolated incident. 3 days later, another chlorine truck bomb hit Fallujah, targeting a police station. Then another in Ramadi on February 28th. Then Al-Anbar University on March 3rd. Then multiple attacks in Baghdad. The pace was accelerating, sometimes multiple chlorine attacks in a single day across different locations. The pattern was clear. This was a campaign, not a series of unrelated incidents. Someone had decided that chlorine bombs were the new tactical innovation, and they were deploying them systematically. But here's what the casualty figures started revealing, and what would eventually doom this tactic. Chlorine bombs weren't actually very deadly. Across the entire campaign from January through mid-2007, total deaths directly attributable to chlorine attacks numbered somewhere between 50 and 100 people. That sounds significant until you realize there were 60-plus attacks. That's roughly 1 to 2 deaths per attack on average, with many attacks causing 0 deaths. The vast majority of deaths came from the conventional explosives in the bombs, not from the chlorine itself. Thousands of people were exposed to chlorine gas and required medical treatment, but most recovered without permanent injury. For comparison, conventional suicide bombings and IED attacks in Iraq during this same period were killing dozens to hundreds per attack. The deadliest single attack of 2007, the Tal Afar truck bombings in July, killed over 500 people using conventional explosives with no chemical component. So why were insurgents using chlorine if it wasn't particularly lethal? Because lethality wasn't really the point. Understanding why chlorine bombs were being used requires understanding how they actually worked, and more importantly, why they didn't work as well as you might think. The construction was relatively straightforward, which was part of the appeal. Start with a vehicle. Usually a truck, sometimes a car, occasionally even a tanker truck if you could steal or buy one. Load it with conventional explosives. Military ordnance like artillery shells was preferred because they were designed to explode, but commercial explosives or homemade bombs work too. Then add industrial chlorine. The chlorine came from various sources, and this tells you something about Iraq's infrastructure in 2007. Despite years of war, Iraq still had functioning water treatment plants that needed chlorine to purify drinking water. It had swimming pools at hotels and government facilities. It had industrial facilities that used chlorine in manufacturing. And crucially, security at these facilities was often minimal or non-existent because nobody had imagined chlorine as a weapon that needed protecting. Chlorine can be stored in several forms, each with different characteristics. Compressed chlorine gas in steel cylinders is common for smaller applications. These cylinders typically hold 50 to 150 pounds of chlorine under about 85 psi of pressure. Liquid chlorine in larger tanks is used for industrial applications and water treatment. Chlorine's boiling point is 34 bar/deg, so at room temperature it's a liquid under pressure. When that pressure is suddenly released, it vaporizes rapidly, expanding in volume by roughly 450 times. Now imagine detonating a bomb next to or containing these pressurized containers. The explosion ruptures the containers, releasing the contents instantly. The heat from the explosion accelerates vaporization of liquid chlorine. The blast wave helps disperse the gas. And because chlorine is 2.5 times heavier than air, it doesn't rise and dissipate quickly like smoke. It flows downward and outward, seeking low ground, following the terrain like water. In theory, this creates a toxic cloud that spreads from the blast site, affecting everyone in its path. In practice, it was way more complicated. First, there's the problem of dispersion. Open-air explosions disperse chemicals rapidly and unevenly. Wind patterns, buildings, temperature gradients, all of these affect how the gas spreads. Chlorine might flow in one direction based on wind, concentrating in some areas while leaving others untouched. The World War I use of chlorine required releasing it continuously from cylinders over extended periods under carefully chosen weather conditions. A single explosive release doesn't allow for that kind of control. Second, chlorine is detectable at very low concentrations, well before it becomes dangerous. That bleach smell appears at 0.2 to 0.4 ppm, but the IDLH level isn't until 10 ppm. This means people could smell chlorine and flee or take protective action, covering their face with wet cloth, getting to high ground, leaving the area. Before exposure reached dangerous levels. Nerve agents don't give you that warning. They can kill before you know you've been exposed. Third, the lethality problem. To kill someone with chlorine gas requires sustained exposure to relatively high concentrations. Remember that LC50 figure, 293 ppm for an hour. In an open-air environment with wind and dispersion, achieving and maintaining those concentrations is extremely difficult. Most victims of chlorine attacks were exposed to uncomfortable or moderately dangerous levels, enough to cause coughing, eye irritation, temporary breathing difficulty, but not enough to kill unless they were very close to the release point or unable to evacuate. Fourth, and this was a serious problem for the insurgents, chlorine is dangerous to the people deploying it. Handling compressed gas cylinders or liquid chlorine tanks is inherently risky. Leaks during transport or preparation expose bomb makers to chlorine. The suicide bombers driving these trucks to their targets were sitting next to containers of toxic gas that might leak. And if the bomb failed to detonate properly, which happened, the driver might be exposed to their own chemical weapon. There are documented cases of insurgents being killed or incapacitated by chlorine leaks while preparing or transporting these devices. Fifth, the environmental factors were unpredictable. Chlorine released outdoors in hot Iraqi weather evaporates and disperses faster than in cool, stable conditions. Daytime convection currents lift gases upward, reducing ground-level concentrations. Buildings can channel gas in unexpected directions or trap it in courtyard compounds. Wind shifts can blow chlorine back toward the attack site or away from intended targets. Compare this to World War I chlorine attacks. Those involved releasing hundreds of tons of chlorine from thousands of cylinders simultaneously under carefully chosen weather conditions, stable air, proper wind direction, appropriate temperature, and the gas still didn't kill as many soldiers as explosive shells did. The British and French quickly adapted with improvised protective measures. Breathing through urine-soaked cloth was horrific but somewhat effective because the ammonia in urine can neutralize chlorine. The insurgents in Iraq were trying to achieve chemical attack effects with maybe a few hundred pounds of chlorine released in an uncontrolled explosion in urban areas with unpredictable conditions. It's almost surprising it worked as well as it did. But working needs to be defined carefully here. If success means killing large numbers of people efficiently, chlorine bombs failed. If success means creating terror, generating international condemnation, and demonstrating that insurgents could weaponize industrial chemicals, then they succeeded, at least initially. The question that was probably going through military planners' minds in early 2007 was, how do we respond to this? Because responding to improvised chemical attacks isn't in most training manuals. The American and Iraqi forces responding to chlorine attacks faced challenges that went beyond typical combat medicine. This wasn't treating gunshot wounds or blast trauma, conditions that military medics train extensively to handle. This was chemical exposure, and the playbook was different. When the first chlorine attacks hit in early 2007, there was confusion. Reports would come in of a bombing with some kind of chemical involved. First responders arriving at the scene would smell the distinctive chlorine odor, see the yellow-green haze, and encounter victims with symptoms that didn't match typical blast injuries: severe coughing, respiratory distress, burning eyes, fluid in the lungs. Initial identification was often done through smell and symptom recognition. Chlorine has that distinctive bleach smell that's recognizable to almost anyone. Medics and soldiers would arrive at a scene, immediately smell chlorine, and know they were dealing with a chemical attack. But confirmation required detection equipment, and that's where problems emerged. The U.S. military had chemical detection equipment designed for battlefield use, systems that could identify military chemical warfare agents like nerve gas or mustard gas. But chlorine is an industrial chemical, not a traditional chemical weapon, and some detection systems didn't prioritize it or didn't have the right sensors configured for it. It took several months before units operating in areas with chlorine attack risk were widely equipped with detection kits specifically calibrated for industrial chemicals. The medical response was complicated by the nature of chlorine injuries. When chlorine gas is inhaled, it reacts with the moisture in the respiratory tract to form hydrochloric acid. This causes immediate irritation and damage to the mucous membranes, throat, and lungs. In severe cases, it triggers a condition called pulmonary edema. The lungs fill with fluid as damaged tissue leaks fluid into the air spaces. Victims essentially drown in their own bodily fluids. Treatment protocols for chlorine exposure are both straightforward and limited. There's no antidote for chlorine, unlike nerve agents where atropine can counteract the effects, or cyanide where there are specific antidotes. Chlorine exposure is treated symptomatically and supportively. The immediate treatment is to remove the victim from exposure, get them away from the chlorine cloud into fresh air, preferably to high ground since chlorine sinks. Remove contaminated clothing, which can continue emitting chlorine gas. Rinse eyes with clean water if they're burning. For mild exposures, that's often enough. Symptoms will gradually resolve over hours to days. For moderate to severe exposures, the treatment becomes more intensive. Oxygen supplementation to help with breathing. In severe cases, mechanical ventilation if the patient can't breathe adequately on their own. Bronchodilators to open airways that are constricting. Corticosteroids to reduce inflammation in the lungs. IV fluids and medications to manage pulmonary edema if it develops. But here's the critical thing about chlorine exposure. The damage happens fast, and you can't undo it. By the time a victim reaches medical care, the chemical reaction in their lungs has already occurred. Treatment supports the body while it heals, but you can't reverse the damage that's been done. This is different from, say, nerve agent exposure, where rapid administration of antidotes can actually reverse the poisoning if given quickly enough. Combat medics and field hospitals in Iraq had to rapidly adapt to this reality. Chlorine attack victims needed respiratory support, oxygen, breathing treatments, monitoring for pulmonary edema developing hours after exposure. Field hospitals that normally focused on trauma surgery found themselves managing respiratory crises. Medical personnel had to learn to triage chemical exposure victims alongside blast trauma victims from the same attack, determining who needed immediate respiratory support versus who just needed observation. The protective equipment question was interesting. Standard military gas masks were effective against chlorine. Activated charcoal filters can remove chlorine gas from breathing air, but gas masks had to be put on before exposure to be effective. And most chlorine attacks were surprise bombings where people didn't have warning. Some soldiers started carrying gas masks more readily after the first few attacks, but it's impractical to operate in a gas mask constantly just in case. Moreover, protecting Iraqi civilians was nearly impossible. They didn't have gas masks. They didn't have training in recognizing chemical threats. They lived and worked in areas where attacks could happen with no warning. The best protection for civilians was rapid evacuation from affected areas, but that required people recognizing what was happening and knowing to move to high ground and away from the gas. CBRN units, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear response teams conducted approximately 50-plus responses to suspected chemical attacks in Iraq during 2007. These specialized units brought detection equipment, decontamination capability, and expertise in managing chemical incidents. But CBRN units aren't as numerous as infantry or combat medics, and they couldn't be everywhere. Most chlorine attack responses were handled by conventional forces who'd received some training but were learning on the job. Intelligence efforts focused on tracking the chlorine supply chain. Where were insurgents getting large quantities of chlorine? Water treatment plants became targets for security upgrades. Industrial facilities that used chlorine were asked to implement better inventory controls. Coalition forces conducted raids on locations suspected of storing chlorine for weapons production, but Iraq in 2007 wasn't a place where comprehensive supply chain security was possible. The country was barely functional, and tracking every chlorine cylinder was unrealistic. There were human stories in this response that demonstrate both the challenges and the adaptability. Medics described treating victims who'd breathe fine for the first hour after exposure, then suddenly developed severe respiratory distress as delayed pulmonary edema set in. Soldiers described the surreal experience of treating conventional blast wounds while also managing chemical exposure victims at the same scene. Iraqi doctors at civilian hospitals described being overwhelmed with dozens of patients, all presenting with similar respiratory symptoms after an attack, lacking the equipment and medications to treat them all adequately. And there were the long-term cases, victims who survived the initial exposure but developed chronic respiratory problems that would affect them for years or life. But we'll come back to that later. The tactical adaptations were equally important. Units operating in areas with frequent chlorine attacks changed their procedures. When responding to any explosion, they'd retry D-continue approach cautiously and check for chemical indicators before entering the blast zone. They'd position responders upwind and on high ground when possible. They'd establish casualty collection points away from potential gas dispersion areas. They'd coordinate with CBRN teams for any suspected chemical component. But the most effective response wasn't medical or tactical, it was operational. The way to stop chlorine attacks was to stop the people making them. And that required intelligence, raids, and disrupting the networks that were producing these weapons, which is exactly what started happening in spring 2007. The peak of chlorine attacks came in March and April 2007. Some estimates suggest 10 to 15 significant chlorine attacks in March alone, with dozens of smaller incidents or attempted attacks. It felt like every few days brought news of another chlorine bombing somewhere in Anbar or Baghdad. The tactic was spreading. Copycat attacks by different insurgent groups, diffusion of the technique through insurgent networks. But by May, the frequency was declining. By August, chlorine attacks had dropped to less than 5 per month. By early 2008, they'd essentially stopped. The entire campaign lasted roughly 6 months before collapsing into irrelevance. What happened? Why did a tactic that seemed to be escalating suddenly fade away? The answer involves multiple factors working together. Not a single dramatic turning point, but rather the accumulation of pressure that made chlorine bombs increasingly difficult to deploy and decreasingly effective when they were. First, and probably most important, was the Anbar Awakening. Starting in late 2006 and accelerating through 2007, Sunni tribes in Anbar Province, the heartland of the insurgency, began turning against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Tribal leaders who'd previously tolerated or supported AQI decided the foreign jihadists were worse than the American occupation. They formed Sons of Iraq militias that actively fought AQI alongside coalition forces. This had a devastating effect on AQI's operational capability. Areas that had been safe havens became hostile territory. Intelligence that had been impossible to collect suddenly poured in from tribal sources. Bomb-making facilities that had operated openly had to go deep underground or be abandoned. The entire support infrastructure that made complex operations possible began crumbling. Chlorine bombs required that infrastructure more than simple IEDs did. You needed access to chlorine sources. You needed facilities to prepare the bombs safely as possible, anyway. You needed technical knowledge about handling compressed gases. You needed vehicles large enough to carry the chlorine containers plus explosives. All of this was harder when the local population was actively hostile and reporting suspicious activity. Second, direct military operations targeted the chlorine bomb networks. Task Force 145 and other special operations units, along with conventional forces, conducted raids specifically targeting people and locations associated with chlorine attacks. They'd capture bomb makers, seize chlorine stockpiles, disrupt planning cells. These operations were intelligence-driven, and the intelligence was getting better. Captured insurgents provided information. Surveillance of chlorine sources identified suspicious purchases. Technical forensics from attack sites could sometimes trace chlorine containers back to their sources. The F3EA cycle, find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, that we talked about in the Zarqawi hunt applied here too, just at smaller scale. There are fewer specific operation names publicly available for the anti-chlorine campaign than for major strategic operations, mostly because these were often raid-level actions rather than division-scale offensives. But the cumulative effect of dozens or hundreds of raids targeting AQI generally and chlorine networks specifically degraded the capability to conduct these attacks. Third, facility security improved. Water treatment plants, industrial sites, anywhere that stored significant quantities of chlorine received security upgrades. This wasn't comprehensive. Iraq in 2007 was too chaotic for that, but it did make chlorine harder to steal in large quantities. Some facilities reduced their chlorine stockpiles or switched to alternative water treatment chemicals that were less weaponizable. Fourth, and this might be the most important factor from the insurgents' perspective, diminishing returns. The first few chlorine attacks generated massive media coverage, international condemnation, panic. They seemed like a strategic game changer. But as attacks continued, the novelty wore off. Media coverage declined. People began understanding that chlorine bombs, while scary, weren't actually that deadly. The psychological impact, which was really the whole point, was diminishing with each attack. From a terrorist strategic perspective, if you're conducting attacks that are difficult, dangerous to prepare, require specialized materials, and they're generating less impact than conventional car bombs, why continue? The cost-benefit analysis shifted against chlorine bombs. There's also evidence that the practical problems kept mounting. Multiple insurgents were killed or injured in accidents involving chlorine, leaks during preparation, premature detonations, exposure while handling materials. The technical challenges of consistently creating effective chlorine dispersal weren't being solved, and attacks that failed to disperse chlorine properly were just expensive conventional bombs. By late 2007, the tactic had largely been abandoned. There would be occasional chlorine attacks in 2008 and even a few in subsequent years, but the sustained campaign was over. AQI and other groups went back to conventional IEDs, suicide bombings, and other tactics that had better proven effectiveness. The U.S. Government Accountability Office, in a 2008 report, noted that chlorine attacks had largely ceased due to the combined factors of military operations, facility security improvements, and loss of AQI operational capability in Anbar. The threat that had dominated headlines in early 2007 had faded by the end of the year. But for the people who'd been exposed to chlorine, the story wasn't over. The attacks might have stopped, but the effects lingered. Medical professionals who've studied industrial chlorine accidents know that exposure can have lasting impacts beyond the immediate crisis. And the victims of Iraq's chlorine attacks, both American soldiers and Iraqi civilians, faced a range of long-term health consequences that aren't captured in the immediate casualty counts. The medical literature on chlorine exposure, drawn largely from industrial accidents rather than warfare, provides a template for understanding these long-term effects. Studies show that 10 to 30% of people exposed to moderate to high concentrations of chlorine develop some form of reactive airways dysfunction syndrome, basically permanent changes to the lungs that cause ongoing breathing problems. What does this mean practically? Victims who were exposed to significant chlorine levels during attacks might experience chronic coughing, increased susceptibility to respiratory infections, asthma-like symptoms that persist for years, reduced lung capacity that shows up in pulmonary function tests. Some victims describe feeling like they can never quite get a full breath, especially during exertion. Others develop heightened sensitivity to irritants like smoke or strong chemicals. The severity varies enormously. Some people exposed to chlorine recovered completely within days or weeks, with no apparent lasting effects. Others, particularly those who were close to the blast site and inhaled high concentrations, or those who had pre-existing respiratory conditions, developed chronic problems that affected their daily lives permanently. A 2008 report from Iraqi health authorities noted increased respiratory complaints in areas that had experienced chlorine attacks, though comprehensive epidemiological data was limited. Iraq's healthcare system in 2007 was barely functional in many areas. Hospitals lacked basic supplies, many doctors had fled the country, keeping detailed long-term health records wasn't a priority when people were focused on surviving day to day. This means we probably don't have complete data on long-term health impacts, and many victims never received proper follow-up care. For American soldiers and contractors who were exposed, the picture is somewhat clearer because the U.S. military medical system tracked them better. Veterans who developed respiratory problems after chlorine exposure in Iraq could receive ongoing treatment and monitoring. Some filed disability claims based on lung damage from chemical exposure. Pulmonary function tests on some of these veterans showed persistent abnormalities years after exposure, reduced FEV1, forced expiratory volume in 1 second, increased airway reactivity, other markers of lasting lung damage. There's also the psychological dimension. Being exposed to a chemical weapon, even an improvised one, is traumatic in ways that conventional weapons aren't. The invisible nature of the threat, the association with historical atrocities like World War I or the Holocaust, the feeling of being poisoned rather than injured, all of this creates psychological effects beyond typical combat stress. Some victims described ongoing anxiety around chemical smells, panic responses to anything that smelled like bleach or chlorine, nightmares about the attacks. For Iraqi civilians, these psychological effects were compounded by ongoing insecurity, lack of access to mental health care, and the fact that chlorine attacks were just one trauma among many in a war that destroyed their lives. The burden on Iraq's medical infrastructure persisted too. Hospitals and clinics that had treated chlorine attack victims had to continue managing chronic respiratory patients with limited resources. Some victims required ongoing medication, periodic hospitalization for respiratory complications, specialized care that wasn't readily available. The attacks created a public health impact that extended years beyond the bombings themselves. It's worth acknowledging what we don't know. There hasn't been a comprehensive, longitudinal epidemiological study of all chlorine attack victims in Iraq. Such a study would be nearly impossible given the security situation and healthcare system limitations during and after the conflict. The true extent of long-term health impacts across the entire affected population remains uncertain, but what we do know suggests that the casualty figures from 2007, 50 to 100 deaths, thousands exposed, don't capture the full cost. For every person killed, there were others who survived with lasting damage, and for every person physically injured, there were others psychologically scarred by an attack that felt like something from a different era of warfare. This brings us to a broader question. What did these attacks actually accomplish? What was the point, and did it work? To understand why insurgents use chlorine bombs despite their limited lethality, you have to understand that modern terrorism and insurgency is fundamentally about psychology, not body counts. The strategic goal of terrorism is to create political change through fear. You attack to make populations feel unsafe, to undermine confidence in government's ability to protect them, to provoke overreactions that play into your narrative, to generate media coverage that spreads your message and amplifies your threat. The actual casualties from any given attack are almost secondary to the psychological and political effects. Chlorine bombs excelled at generating fear and media attention, at least initially. The first attacks in early 2007 dominated news cycles. Chemical weapons in Iraq, terrorists crossing a line that civilized nations had agreed was beyond the pale. The symbolism was powerful. Echoes of World War I, of Saddam gassing the Kurds, of worst-case terrorism scenarios that security officials had warned about for years. For coalition forces, these attacks undermined the narrative of progress in Iraq. Just when military leaders were talking about improved security and reduced violence, here was this terrifying new threat. For Iraqi civilians, chlorine attacks reinforced the sense that nowhere was safe, that their government and the Americans couldn't protect them even from weapons that shouldn't exist. From AQI's perspective, this psychological impact was the entire point. They wanted to terrorize Shia populations into fleeing mixed neighborhoods. They wanted to demonstrate that coalition forces couldn't secure even basic infrastructure like water treatment plants. They wanted to provoke sectarian overreactions that would further destabilize Iraq. And they wanted media coverage that would attract foreign fighters and funding to their cause. The problem, from the insurgent's strategic perspective, was that the psychological impact followed a predictable curve of diminishing returns. Terrorism researchers have documented this pattern. The first attack of a novel type generates maximum fear and media coverage. The second attack gets somewhat less. By the 10th or 20th attack, people have adjusted psychologically. Media coverage has declined, and the attacks are just another part of the ongoing violence. This is exactly what happened with chlorine bombs. The February 2007 attacks were front-page news internationally. By May 2007, chlorine attacks were getting brief mentions in wire service reports. By the time the tactic was abandoned in late 2007, they'd become almost routine. Terrible, but not exceptional in a war filled with terrible things. Moreover, the gap between perceived danger and actual danger became apparent over time. Initially, there was panic about chemical weapons. But as casualty figures accumulated, it became clear that chlorine bombs killed fewer people than conventional truck bombs. This realization that chlorine attacks were scary but not particularly deadly reduced their psychological impact. Coalition information operations also countered the fear factor. Public information campaigns explained what chlorine was, how to protect yourself, move to high ground, leave the area, don't stay in low-lying areas, what symptoms to watch for. Medical briefings emphasized that most exposures weren't life-threatening and victims usually recovered. This education reduced panic and gave people a sense of agency. There were things you could do to protect yourself, unlike with suicide bombings where there's often no warning. The propaganda value for insurgents also proved limited. While chlorine attacks generated initial media attention, the international reaction was largely negative, even from groups that might otherwise be sympathetic to anti-occupation resistance. Chemical weapons have such strong taboo associations that using them made insurgents look barbaric rather than heroic. Even some insurgent groups that had cooperated with AQI distanced themselves from chlorine attacks. And there's evidence that chlorine attacks contributed to the Anbar Awakening. Sunni tribal leaders who tolerated AQI's violence against Americans and Shia became disillusioned when chlorine attacks started affecting Sunni civilians in their own communities. The indiscriminate nature of chemical dispersal meant that tribal areas weren't safe from AQI's tactics, which undermined AQI's position as defenders of Sunni interests. So the strategic calculus ended up looking like this. Chlorine bombs were difficult to produce, dangerous to handle, required specialized materials and knowledge, had high failure rates, killed fewer people than conventional explosives, generated diminishing psychological impact over time, created negative propaganda, and contributed to loss of local support. Meanwhile, conventional IEDs and suicide bombs were easier, safer to produce, more reliably lethal, and didn't carry the same taboo baggage. By late 2007, it's likely that insurgent planners simply concluded chlorine wasn't worth the effort. The tactic was abandoned not primarily because coalition forces stopped it, though they contributed, but because it didn't work well enough to justify continuing. This assessment is borne out by what happened afterward. Insurgent groups in Iraq continued conducting attacks with conventional explosives for years. They continued evolving IED tactics, targeting patterns, suicide bombing techniques. But they largely stopped trying to improvise chemical weapons, despite still having access to industrial chemicals. The experiment had failed. Yet the failure of chlorine bombs in Iraq didn't mean the threat disappeared. It meant it evolved. The lessons from Iraq's chlorine attacks rippled through military and security establishments worldwide, changing how governments think about improvised chemical threats and influencing policy in ways that persist today. For the U.S. military, the experience led to significant updates in doctrine and training. Field Manual 311, which covers chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear operations, was revised to specifically address improvised chemical threats and toxic industrial chemicals used as weapons. Previous versions had focused primarily on traditional military chemical agents, nerve gas, mustard gas, weapons designed for warfare. The Iraq experience showed that industrial chemicals could be weaponized and required different response protocols. CBRN training for deploying units was expanded to include recognition of toxic industrial chemicals. Soldiers learned that chlorine detection is different from nerve agent detection, that exposure symptoms vary by chemical type, that protective measures effective against one category of chemical might not work against another. Detection equipment was diversified to include sensors for industrial chemicals, not just military agents. Medical training evolved too. Combat medics received education on treating various types of chemical exposures, with protocols for recognizing and managing chlorine and similar industrial chemical poisonings. Field hospitals in subsequent deployments were better prepared with appropriate medications and equipment for respiratory support. Equipment procurement changed. The military invested in more versatile detection systems that could identify a broader range of chemical threats. Protective gear was evaluated not just for battlefield chemical weapons, but for industrial chemicals. Decontamination procedures were expanded to cover scenarios the Iraq chlorine attacks had revealed. But perhaps more importantly, the operational approach to chemical security changed. Intelligence collection priorities were adjusted to include monitoring of toxic industrial materials, not just traditional WMD components. Facility security programs in Iraq and Afghanistan were implemented to protect chemical storage sites. Raids and targeting decisions incorporated considerations about denying insurgents access to improvised chemical materials. The lessons transferred beyond the military. The Department of Homeland Security issued guidance to civilian infrastructure operators in the United States about securing hazardous chemicals following the Iraq incidents. Water treatment plants, chemical manufacturers, facilities storing large quantities of toxic materials all received recommendations about improved security measures to prevent terrorist acquisition. This led to policy developments like the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards (CFATS) program, which requires high-risk chemical facilities to develop and implement security plans. While CFATS had been in development before Iraq's chlorine attacks, those attacks provided concrete examples of why such regulations were necessary and accelerated implementation. Information sharing improved between military, intelligence, and civilian agencies regarding chemical threats. The experience showed that military chemical threats and civilian hazmat threats overlap. What's a water treatment chemical in peacetime becomes a potential weapon in conflict zones. This recognition led to better coordination between organizations that had previously operated in separate spheres. Intelligence community analysis of terrorist capabilities was refined. The Iraq chlorine campaign demonstrated that improvised chemical weapons don't require sophisticated laboratory capabilities or advanced technical knowledge. Determined groups can weaponize commercially available materials. This informed threat assessments and counterproliferation efforts. Internationally, the attacks sparked discussions about strengthening the Chemical Weapons Convention and improving enforcement mechanisms. While chlorine isn't technically covered by the CWC as a scheduled chemical because of its legitimate commercial uses, the Iraq attacks demonstrated that toxic industrial chemicals used as weapons should be considered violations of international norms against chemical warfare. The lessons also influenced how coalition forces approached other conflicts. When Syria's civil war began in 2011 and chemical weapons became part of that conflict, military planners drew on Iraq's experience. They understood how chemical attacks affected populations, what effective responses looked like, how to support victims, and crucially, how to document chemical attacks for intelligence and potential war crimes prosecutions. Special Operations Forces incorporated lessons about improvised chemical threats into their training and operations. Task forces hunting terrorist leaders included expertise in identifying and securing chemical materials during raids. Exploitation of captured sites looked for evidence of chemical weapon development even when the chemicals involved were commercial materials. The Iraq experience also taught humility about prediction and preparedness. Despite years of concern about terrorist chemical attacks, the actual threat that emerged, improvised chlorine bombs in a war zone, wasn't quite what anyone had expected. This influenced planning to be more flexible and adaptive rather than fixated on specific scenarios. And there's an uncomfortable lesson about the limits of prevention. Despite knowing about chlorine attacks, despite implementing countermeasures, despite raids and security upgrades and intelligence efforts, the coalition couldn't completely stop them while they were happening. The attacks were stopped ultimately by the collapse of the networks deploying them, not by perfect defenses. This reality that you can't stop everything and success sometimes means reducing attacks rather than eliminating them, influenced counterterrorism strategy broadly. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the nature of chemical threats in modern conflict. Iraq showed that chemical warfare isn't necessarily about military-grade agents developed by state programs. It can be about industrial chemicals weaponized by non-state actors who understand that the fear of chemical weapons matters more than their actual effectiveness. And that means the threat can come from unexpected directions, require unconventional responses, and defy traditional categories of WMD versus conventional weapons. Which brings us to a critical question. Does this threat still exist? And what does the Iraq experience tell us about chemical security today? The chlorine bomb attacks in Iraq weren't an isolated historical incident. They were an example of a broader category of threat that persists and evolves. According to the Global Terrorism Database, there have been dozens of attempted or successful attacks worldwide involving toxic industrial chemicals since 2007. The specific tactic of chlorine truck bombs may have been largely abandoned after Iraq, but the concept of improvised chemical weapons remains in the terrorist and insurgent toolkit. Syria's civil war, beginning in 2011, saw extensive use of chlorine as a weapon, not primarily by rebel groups, but by the Assad regime against civilian populations. Barrel bombs filled with chlorine cylinders dropped from helicopters, artillery shells loaded with chlorine, rocket attacks dispersing chlorine gas. The tactics were different from Iraq, air-delivered rather than truck bombs, but the weapon was the same and the strategic goal was similar: terrorize populations, make areas unlivable, force displacement. The Syrian chlorine attacks reinforced lessons from Iraq about how chlorine works as a weapon and how it doesn't. Casualty counts were often modest relative to the scale of attacks. The most severe incidents occurred when chlorine was released in enclosed spaces, buildings, basements, tunnels, where the gas could accumulate to dangerous concentrations rather than dispersing rapidly in open air. This matches what we'd expect from Iraq's experience and from World War I. Chlorine is most dangerous in confined or low-lying areas where it can't dissipate. ISIS, which emerged from the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, experimented with various improvised chemical weapons during its territorial control of parts of Iraq and Syria from 2014-2017. They used chlorine, mustard agent, manufactured in crude facilities, and other chemical materials. The sophistication varied, and like Iraq's earlier chlorine campaign, the actual military effectiveness was limited. But the psychological impact and the violation of chemical weapons norms made these attacks strategically significant beyond their casualty counts. Beyond conflict zones, there have been terrorist plots and attacks involving toxic chemicals in multiple countries. Some used improvised devices, others attempted to sabotage industrial facilities to cause chemical releases. Still others explored combinations of conventional explosives and toxic materials. Most were disrupted before execution or failed in execution, but they demonstrate ongoing terrorist interest in chemical weapons. The accessibility problem hasn't been solved. Chlorine, ammonia, and other toxic industrial chemicals remain essential to modern civilization. Water treatment, agriculture, manufacturing, healthcare all depend on chemicals that could potentially be weaponized. You can't eliminate these materials without crippling infrastructure and industry. So the challenge becomes securing them adequately without imposing impossible burdens on legitimate users. The chemical facility, anti-terrorism standards in the U.S., and similar programs in other countries represent attempts to balance security and functionality. High-risk facilities must assess threats, implement security measures, restrict access, monitor inventories, report suspicious activities. But enforcement is uneven, compliance varies, and determined attackers with insider access or sophisticated planning might still acquire materials. Emerging threats include new chemicals and novel delivery methods. As industries adopt different chemical processes, new toxic materials become available. As drone technology advances, aerial dispersal of chemicals becomes more feasible for non-state actors. As 3D printing and small-scale manufacturing improve, producing improvised chemical devices becomes easier. But there's also reason for measured optimism. The Iraq experience and subsequent incidents have shown that improvised chemical weapons are difficult to use effectively. Most attempts fail or produce limited effects. Defensive measures, while imperfect, do make attacks harder. Public health infrastructure for responding to chemical incidents has improved. The taboo against chemical weapons remains strong, limiting their appeal even to groups willing to conduct horrific attacks. The key insight from Iraq is that improvised chemical weapons sit in an unusual space. They're terrifying but not particularly lethal. They're accessible but difficult to use effectively. They generate massive attention but diminishing psychological impact over time. This doesn't mean they're not a threat. The panic and disruption they cause matters, and individual victims suffer real harm. But it does mean they're a different category of threat than either conventional terrorism or state-level WMD programs. For military and security forces, this means maintaining capability to respond to chemical incidents without becoming fixated on them at the expense of more common threats. Chemical attack response is a specialized skill set that units need, but it's one capability among many, not the defining focus of counterterrorism. For policymakers, it means continuing efforts to secure toxic industrial materials while recognizing perfect security is impossible, and that resilience, the ability to respond and recover from attacks, may be more achievable than pure prevention. For the public, it means understanding that chemical attack threats exist and require serious response, but also that they're not the apocalyptic scenarios sometimes portrayed in media or fiction. The reality, as Iraq showed, is usually less dramatic, but still serious: localized effects, manageable casualties, difficult but possible response, and ultimately, failure of the tactic to achieve strategic goals. So what should we take away from the story of chlorine bombs in Iraq? First, that terrorism and insurgency constantly evolve. adapting to what's effective and abandoning what's not. Chlorine bombs emerged because insurgents thought they'd found a new tactical advantage. They disappeared because that advantage didn't materialize. This process, innovation, adoption, failure or counter, abandonment or evolution, is fundamental to how asymmetric conflicts develop. Understanding this dynamic helps predict what threats might emerge and how they might evolve. Second, that the scariest weapons aren't always the most effective ones. Chlorine bombs generated far more fear than their actual lethality justified. This gap between perception and reality is something terrorists deliberately exploit. They want targets to overreact, to implement security measures that disrupt daily life, to spend resources protecting against threats that might not be as dangerous as they seem. The challenge for defenders is calibrating response appropriately, taking threats seriously without giving them more power through overreaction. Third, that industrial civilization creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited, but also creates capabilities for response. The same chemicals that can be weaponized also enable water purification, medicine, and countless other beneficial uses. The same communications technology that allows terrorists to coordinate also enables rapid response and information sharing by security forces. The same transportation networks that allow bombs to reach targets also allow medical care to reach victims. Vulnerability and capability are often two sides of the same coin. Fourth, that historical patterns persist even as technology changes. Chlorine was the first modern chemical weapon in 1915, weaponized again in Iraq in 2007 and used in Syria in the 2010s. The tactical details changed. Cylinders opened along trenches versus truck bombs versus barrel bombs from helicopters, but the fundamental weapon and its characteristics remained consistent. Understanding history provides context for contemporary threats that might seem unprecedented but actually have deep roots. Fifth, that the human cost of warfare extends far beyond immediate casualties. The soldiers and civilians who survived chlorine attacks in Iraq still deal with respiratory problems, psychological trauma, and disrupted lives years later. These long-term costs don't appear in casualty statistics but are no less real for the people experiencing them. This is true of warfare generally, but chemical weapons attacks seem to carry particularly heavy long-term burdens. Sixth, that international norms and laws matter even when they're violated. The widespread condemnation of chlorine attacks, even from parties that might otherwise support anti-occupation resistance, showed that the chemical weapons taboo remains powerful. This norm didn't prevent attacks, but it did shape responses, limit their political effectiveness, and contribute to their eventual abandonment. Maintaining and strengthening these norms is part of limiting the worst excesses of conflict. And finally, that ordinary people, soldiers, medics, civilians, demonstrate remarkable adaptability when confronted with threats they weren't prepared for. The response to chlorine attacks in Iraq involved improvisation, learning under pressure, sharing information rapidly, and gradually developing effective countermeasures despite initial confusion and lack of preparation. This human capacity to adapt shouldn't be counted on as a defense strategy, but it's a reality that shapes how conflicts unfold. The chlorine bomb campaign in Iraq lasted roughly 6 months in 2007. In that time, it killed approximately 50 to 100 people. Terrible, but far fewer than conventional weapons killed during the same period. It exposed thousands to toxic gas, many of whom recovered, but some of whom carry lasting damage. It generated international headlines and panic. It sparked debates about chemical security and terrorism. And ultimately, it failed to achieve its strategic objectives, abandoned by the insurgents who'd adopted it as a tactic. Today, chlorine bombs in Iraq are a historical footnote in a long war filled with violence. But they're a footnote worth studying because they reveal how modern conflicts evolve, how terrorists think, how defenses adapt, and how an everyday chemical can become a weapon of terror, and how even a weapon of terror can fail when it doesn't actually work well enough to justify its costs. The next time someone tries to weaponize industrial chemicals, defenders will be slightly better prepared because of what was learned in Iraq. Medical personnel will know the treatment protocols. Military units will have better detection equipment and training. Facilities will have better security. Intelligence agencies will watch for the warning signs, and maybe, just maybe, the attacks will be disrupted sooner, the casualties will be lower, and the tactic will fail faster than it did in 2007. That's not a victory exactly. It's more like damage limitation, learning from past failures to make future failures less catastrophic. But in the messy reality of counterterrorism and modern warfare, damage limitation is often the best you can hope for. Perfect security doesn't exist. Threats will continue evolving. Bad things will still happen. But we can learn from what's happened before. We can understand the patterns, recognize the tactics, implement countermeasures, train responders, educate populations, and create systems that make attacks harder and responses more effective. The chlorine bombs of Iraq taught those lessons at the cost of dozens of lives and thousands of people harmed. The question is whether we'll retain those lessons long enough for them to matter the next time someone decides industrial chemicals look like an opportunity for terrorism. Because there will be a next time, in some form, somewhere. The materials exist, the knowledge exists, the motivations exist. What also exists now is experience, hard-won, expensive experience, and how these attacks work and how to respond. That's the value in studying even the ugly, disturbing parts of recent history. Not to glorify violence or sensationalize terror, but to understand it well enough to counter it slightly more effectively next time. The chlorine clouds that rolled through Iraqi streets in 2007 have long since dissipated. The victims have mostly healed or learned to live with damage that won't heal. The tactic has been abandoned. The war moved on to other horrors. But the lessons remain, written in field manuals and medical protocols and security procedures and institutional memory. Imperfect lessons, incomplete lessons, lessons that will need updating as threats evolve. But lessons nonetheless, and in the difficult work of preventing and responding to terrorism, sometimes that's all you get. The knowledge that you'll handle it slightly better than last time, bought at the price of not handling it well enough the first time. That's the real story of chlorine bombs in Iraq. Not a story of villains vanquished or heroes triumphant, but a story of threats emerged, responses improvised, tactics countered, lessons learned, and lives changed forever by a chemical that shouldn't have been a weapon at all. 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 Shouldn't have